I don't have much time left. By the time you read this, I'm sure she'll have found me. Some of you will think I should try harder to escape her, but there's no use. She'll eventually catch me. Others will wonder why I even wrote this or why I didn't tell someone close to me. It's simple. I want my story known before she gets here, and no one close to me is left. She has made sure of it. The first time I saw her was when I was 13. My parents picked me up after hockey practice, and we were traveling back home from town. Snow fell lightly on the trees and flitted across the road, the whirling snowflakes illuminated by the headlights. My parents asked me how practice was, and I told them about it, embellishing the story of a goal that I had made. I remember my mom's smile as she listened to me. I've since etched every detail of it into my memory, because it was the last time I saw her face alive. She looked so proud. We rounded a corner, and the car began to swerve. My dad yelled and fought for control of the car, but the road was too icy. The rubber refused to grip. Even though it was but an instant, I remember looking out my window and seeing a woman standing in the middle of the road. She had dark skin and wore a long, flowing sheer black dress. As we careened out of control, she stared at the car, never moving, not even flinching. Like she wasn't surprised or troubled by what was happening. My eyes were still on her as the car rammed into a pine tree. Everything happened at once, breaking wood, bending metal, screams, shattering glass. The impact knocked the wind out of me, and I was dazed for a minute. When I came to my senses, I wanted to check if my parents were okay. As I looked forward, the woman crawled over the crumpled remains of the car's hood. She made slow, but deliberate progress. The light from the remaining headlight reflected off the fallen snow, making it possible to discern details. Despite climbing through wreckage, she amazingly never once caught her dress on anything. She maneuvered herself gracefully around the tree limbs, careful not to touch them. A few more shards of windshield glass dropped and clinked onto the dashboard as she climbed through. Once inside, she looked at my dad and nodded once. Once inside, she looked at my dad and nodded once. She turned her face towards my mom and nodded again. Her head turned as she looked to me. She placed one hand on my dad's shoulder and the other on my mom's. She used their shoulders to prop herself up as she leaned towards me to get a better look. She stopped inches from my face. Her cool, misty breath swirled around and kissed my face. The darkness of her skin, irises, and pupils stood in stark contrast to how brilliantly white the rest of her eyes were. She stared at me, unblinkingly. Her gaze was not menacing, nor was it kind. She studied me for a moment, and the overwhelming feeling I got from her was neutrality. Like I didn't matter to her. Her cold indifference scared me more than anything else could have. Without breaking her gaze, she slowly pushed herself back, using my parents' shoulders to steady herself, and whispered to me as she retreated back through the windshield. "I'll come for you." I probably should go out to the garage and start the car. She'll be here soon. After my parents died, I moved from my small town to Toronto to live with my grandma on my mom's side. She was the only relative I had left. My parents were both only children and had me when they were already in their 40s. My other grandparents had already passed away. My grandma was caring and wonderful, the best guardian I could have asked for. She was comfortably retired, so she was always there for me during my teenage years, even though life without my parents was hard. Just as my second term at university ended, Grandma's health started to decline. Even the smallest efforts around the house overtasked her lungs. I loved her, and was her only remaining family, so I decided to put my education on hold to take care of her. One night, after my grandma went to bed, I had gone into my room to read. My room was just down the hall from Grandma's, and I always kept the door propped open so I could hear her if she needed me. I was looking down at my book when I noticed movement by my door. I looked up at the cracked open door and glimpsed a transitory flutter of sheer black fabric. I've wondered that if I hadn't frozen in fear at that moment, I might have been able to save her. I sat in my bed terrified that the woman had returned, thinking she was here for me. I relived the memories of my parents' death and the indifferent look on the woman's face. That face that haunted and tainted my childhood memories. After a minute or two of inaction, I remembered Grandma, and concern flooded over me. I yelled for her as I jumped out of bed, raced down the hall, and barged into her room. The black woman was standing next to the bed. One hand pinched Grandma's nose, the other covered her mouth. Grandma twitched and made feeble attempts to struggle for air, but I'd arrived too late. Her movement stopped. I screamed and ran towards the woman, demanding that she release Grandma. The woman turned her head and examined me indifferently as she fled out the French doors that led to the balcony. As she left, she called back up to me. "I'll be back soon." Now that I'm finally in the car, it's comforting in a way. I had expected it to be. It's where I first saw her, and it's where she'll probably find me. When I started the car, the engine's purr soothed my pains and set my fears aside. After Grandma died, I inherited both her money and the house. I lived comfortably for a few years, but I knew I needed to return to college if I were going to maintain the style of living I'd grown accustomed to. A few months ago, I was sitting in class when I fell out of my chair and had a seizure. The seizure was quite violent, and so much that I cut my head pretty severely and was rushed to the hospital. In the hospital, they treated my head wounds and ran some tests to determine why I had seized. The doctor came into my room and didn't mince words. He told me that I had an inoperable brain tumor. I had 6 months left to live, at best. My stomach dropped as panic overtook me. Yes, I was panicked because of the doctor's news. But what really frightened me was that the black woman's face was lightly pressed against the window on my door. She peered through and locked eyes with me. She slowly raised her hand and waved. Then, she just walked away. Through my panic, I told the doctor about the woman. I was so hysterical the nurses had to sedate me, and the doctor ordered that I be put under psychiatric watch. I knew I didn't have much time left to live, and I didn't want to spend it in the psych ward. Consequently, I was careful never to mention the woman, even though she was all I could think of. I saw her indifferent face everywhere. I'd see her looking at me from outside my window. She wandered the halls behind me, inching closer and closer each day. She had taken the only people I loved away from me, and now she haunted with indifference while I suffered. I hated her. When I was finally discharged, I spent a little over a month going back and forth between home and the hospital. Through all the BS the doctors were giving me about experimental procedures, I understood that there was no hope. The best they could do was maybe extend my life a little bit, nothing more. I would only suffer through a few agonizing months, maybe up to a year, as my body and health deteriorated. The whole time I was debating how I wanted to proceed, I would wake up at night and see the woman standing outside my bedroom window, staring in at me. Eventually, I accepted that I was going to die and there was nothing I could do about it. I elected to stop all treatment. After making that decision, the woman's lingering presence ceased to bother me. I realized that she had remained the only constant in my short life. I knew she'd always be there, and I didn't want to wait for her to come for me. I decided to invite her over. And that leads me to now. I had made sure to get an old car without a catalytic converter. I sealed off the cracks around the garage so that no exhaust could escape. The air is hazy now, and I'm starting to feel tired. I want to finish reading this before she arrives. Like I said, I used to fear her, but the black woman has been my constant companion, waiting for me my whole life. A peaceful smile is touching my lips because I know that, at any moment, she will rise up out of the mist. She'll look at me, tell me she's finally come for me, and we'll go hand in hand back to her home.